Chapter 27 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 27. The Conquest. There was no star-storming confidence in Kate Cumberland after that first victory. Rather, she felt as the general who deploys his skirmishers and drives in the outposts of an enemy. The advantage is his, but it has really only served to give him some intimation of the strength of the enemy. At the supper table this night she found Whistling Dan watching her, not openly, for she could never catch his eye, but subtly, secretly. She knew that he was measuring her, studying her, whether in hostility, amity, or mere wonder, she could not tell. Finally a vast uneasiness overtook her, and she turned to the doctor for relief. Dr. Randall Byrne held a singular position in the intention of Kate. Since the night of the fire and her open talk with him, the doctor knew everything, and women are troubled in the presence of a man who knows the details of the past. The shield behind which they hide in social intercourse is a touch of mystery, or at least a hope of mystery. The doctor, however, was not like other men. He was more similar to a precocious child, and she comforted herself in his obvious talent for silence. If he had been alert, strong, self-confident, she might have hated him because he knew so much about her. But when she noted the pale, thoughtful face, the vast forehead outbalancing the other features, and the wistful, uncertain eyes, she felt nothing towards him stronger than pity. It is good for a woman to have something which she may pity, a child, an aged parent, or a house dog. It provides in a way the background against which she acts. So Kate, when in doubt, turned to the doctor, as on this night. There was a certain cruelty in it, for when she smiled at him, the poor doctor became crimson, and when she talked to him, his answers stumbled on his tongue. And when she was silent and merely looked at him, that was the worst of all, for he became unable to manage knife and fork, and would sit crumbling bread and looking frightened. Then he was apt to draw out his glasses and make a move to place them on his nose, but he always caught and checked himself in time, which added to his embarrassment. These small maneuvers had not lasted long before the girl became aware that the silent attention of Whistling Dan had passed from her to the doctor, and held steadily upon him. She did not go so far as to call it jealousy, but certainly it was a grave and serious consideration that measured the doctor up and down and back again, and it left her free to examine the two men in contrast. For the first time it struck her that they were much alike in many ways. Physically, for instance, there was the same slenderness, the same delicacy with which details were finished, the same fragile hands, for instance. The distinction lay in a suggestion of strength and inexhaustible reserve of energy which Dan Barry possessed. The distinction lay still more in their faces. That of Byrne was worn and pallid from the long quest and struggle for truth. The body was feeble, the eyes were uncertain, but within there was a powerful machine which could work infallibly from the small to the large and the large to the small. With Whistling Dan there was no suggestion at all of mental care. She could not imagine him worrying over a problem. His knowledge was not even communicable by words. It was more impalpable than the instinct of a woman, and there was about him the wisdom and the coldness of Black Bart himself. The supper ended too soon for Kate. She had been rallying Randall Byrne, and as soon as he could graciously leave, the poor fellow rose with a crimson face and left the room, and behind him, sauntering apparently in the most casual manner, went Whistling Dan. As for Kate Cumberland, she could not put all the inferences together. She dared not, but when she lay in her bed that night it was a long time before she could sleep, for there was a voice inside her singing. She chose her time the next day. Dan alternated between Black Bart and old Joe Cumberland during most of the day, and no sooner had he left the wolf dog in the morning than she went out to Bart. As always, Black Bart lay with his head flattened against the sand, dreaming in the sun, and not an eyelid quivered when she approached, yet she understood perfectly that the animal knew every move she made. She would have attempted to dress the wound again, but the memory of the ordeal of yesterday was too terrible. She might break down in the midst of her effort, and the first sign of weakness, she knew, was the only spur which Black Bart needed. So she went instead to the chair where Dan often sat for hours near the dog, and there she took her place, folded her hands on her lap, and waited. She had no particular plan in mind, more than that she hoped to familiarize the great brute with the sight of her. Once he had known her well enough, but now he had forgotten all that passed before as completely, no doubt, as Whistling Dan himself had forgotten. While she sat there musing, she remembered a scene that had occurred not many a month before. She had been out walking one fall day, and had gone from the house down past the corrals where a number of cattle newly driven in from the range were penned. They were to be driven off for shipment the next day. A bellowing caught her ear from one of the enclosures, and she saw two bulls standing horn to horn, their heads lowered, and their puffing and snorting breaths knocking up the dust while they pawed the sand back in clouds against their flanks. While she watched, they rushed together, bellowing, and for a moment they swayed back and forth. It was an unequal battle, however, for one of the animals was a hardened veteran, scarred from many a battle on the range, while the other was a young 3-year-old with a body not half so strong as his heart. For a short time he sustained the weight of the larger bull, but eventually his knees buckled and then dropped heavily against the earth. At that the older bull drew back a little and charged again. This time he avoided the long horns of his rival and made the unprotected flank of the animal his target. If he had charged squarely, the horns would have been buried to the head, but striking at an angle, only one of them touched the target and delivered a long, ripping blow. With the blood streaming down his side, the wounded bull made off into a group of cows, and when the victor pursued him closely, he at length turned tail and leaped the low fence, for the corral was a new one, hastily built for the occasion. The conqueror raised his head inside the fence and bellowed his triumph, and outside the fence the other commenced pawing up the sand again, switching his tail across his bleeding side and turning his little red eyes here and there. They fixed at length upon Kate Cumberland, and she remembered with a start of horror that she was wearing a bright red blouse. The next instant the bull was charging. She turned in a hopeless flight. Safety was hundreds of yards away in the house. The skirts tangled about her legs, and behind her the dull impacts of the bull's hoofs swept close and closer. Then she heard a snarl in front, a deep-throated, murderous snarl, and she saw Black Bart racing towards her. He whizzed by her like a black thunderbolt. There was a roar and bellow behind her, and at the same time she stumbled over a fence board and fell upon her knees. But when she cast a glance of terror behind her, she saw the bull lying on its side with lolling tongue and glazing eyes, and the fangs of Black Bart were buried in its throat. When she reached this point in her musing, her glance naturally turned towards the wolf dog, and she started violently when she saw that Bart was slinking towards her, trailing the helpless leg. The moment he felt her eyes upon him, Bart dropped down, motionless, with a wicked baring of his teeth. His eyes closed, and he seemed, as usual, dreaming in the sun. Was the brute stalking her? It was worse in a way than the ordeal of the day before, this stealthy, noiseless approach, and in her panic she first thought of springing from her chair and reaching a distance which the chain would keep him from following. Yet it was very strange. Black Bart, in his wildest days, after Dan brought him to the ranch, had never been prone to wantonly attack human beings, infringe upon his